The soldier and statesman Major General Noel or Nigel Holmes said in 1945, "Without Southampton we could not have done D-Day," yet his words are rarely believed. During the Second World War, he was director of movements at the War Office and attended the conferences at Casablanca, Washington, Quebec, Cairo, Tehran, Yalta and Potsdam. He was invested as a commander of the Order of the British Empire in 1940, a companion of the Order of the Bath in 1943, and a Knight Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 1946. He was also made a commander of the U.S. Legion of Merit, an officer of the French Legion of Honor and received the Croix de Guerre. D-Day and Operation Overlord are by far the most important events in the history of Southampton but are largely forgotten today. So what makes Major General Sir Noel or Nigel Holmes think that without Southampton there could be no D-Day? This extract is taken from the U.S. Army Center of Military History called the Transportation Cooperation Overseas.
The first requisite for the smooth flow of troops and supplies into the United Kingdom was efficient port operations. The U.S. Army already had a small port organization in Northern Ireland. Soon thereafter they extended American port activity to the Glasgow, Liverpool, and Bristol Channel areas, all of which had the great advantage of being relatively safe from enemy action by air and by sea. Subsequently, as the need arose, they placed organizations at other ports, notably at London and Southampton. The task of directing American transportation activities in the United Kingdom was assumed by a young, inexperienced transportation corps. Still in the process of organization in the United States in the spring of 1942, the corps functions and authority were in the formative stage. There was no large pool of officers experienced in transportation matters and no doctrine covering the corps responsibilities overseas. A pioneer among overseas theatre organizations, the Transportation Corps in Britain had to gain recognition within the theatre and assume authority over transportation activities formerly handled by the Quartermaster Corps and the Corps of Engineers. Within the theatre services of supply, the Transportation Corps authority had to be defined vis-a-vis territorial base section commands. Moreover, relations had to be worked out with British transportation agencies. By an evolutionary process the Transportation Corps grew from a small handful of officers and enlisted men into an effective organization that played a vital role in the build-up in Britain, the mounting of the invasion, and the continental operations that followed. In 1943 the 12th Port began relieving the 14th Port, which was slated to expand its operations at Southampton and Plymouth and prepare for the cross-channel attack. During the last half of 1943 the 14th Port supervised the discharge of approximately 350,000 measurement tons of cargo at London, Southampton and Plymouth. Of that amount, 162,224 measurement tons were received at Southampton. After being relieved at London, the 14th Port confined its work to Plymouth and Southampton, of which the latter was to become the main installation. In peacetime a thriving passenger port and a familiar gateway for visitors to the British Isles, it had suffered severely from enemy bombing. As a result, the port had remained idle for some time, and much of its cargo handling equipment had been removed to other ports. Yet despite the considerable damage, Southampton remained one of the best ports in England. Deep water and relatively little tide made it a port of few locks, and there were numerous modern piers as well as 7 graving docks for ship repair. Although many British officials feared that the port was too vulnerable, the Americans reopened it in the summer of 1943, and the fears were soon found to be without foundation. Early U.S. operations were handicapped by the shortage of cargo handling equipment and by labor troubles. Labor at Southampton, as elsewhere in Britain, was in short supply and none too efficient. During the summer and fall of 1943 the activity of the 14th Port at Southampton was interrupted by a number of strikes, several of which represented protests against the presence of American military police who were stationed in the hatches to prevent pilferage. Nevertheless, by October cargo operations had increased substantially. Early in 1944 the headquarters of the 14th Port was moved from London to Southampton. Fairly compact office space and a sufficient number of billets were obtained by using various structures, including the Blymont Barracks, a wing of the Civic Centre, a school, and 2 hotels. In the ensuing months cargo handling facilities were greatly improved and, except for minor squabbles, labour disputes practically ceased. Southampton together with the other ports along the southern and eastern shores of Great Britain, including the Thames and Humber River areas, contributed substantially to the build-up in the British Isles by receiving cargo diverted from the heavily burdened Bristol Channel and Mersey River ports, particularly after July 1943. But Southampton's principal wartime contribution was to be made as a port of embarkation rather than as a port of discharge. In the months preceding the cross-channel assault, the emphasis in transportation corps operations increasingly shifted from receiving personnel and cargo to planning and preparing for the outbound movement to the continent. Since southern England was close to Normandy and the scene of the greatest concentration of American troops, the ports in that area were the logical installations from which to mount and support the invading forces. Area A, containing the marshalling camps and embarkation points clustered about Portsmouth and Gosport, was to be entirely British. Areas B and C, in the vicinity of Southampton, were to be used jointly by the Americans and British, and Area D, emptying into Portland and Weymouth, was to be completely American. The southwestern zone, or 19th District, contained 5 marshalling areas, all American-operated. Embarkation facilities in the southern base section included a large number of artificial loading points as well as piers. Since there were insufficient piers to load all personnel and vehicles on landing craft and vessels, it was decided to construct so-called hards along the south coast of England from Deal westward. Selected and constructed by the British Admiralty, the hards were beaches paved with concrete slabs and connected with the main highways. At these hards, landing craft could lower their ramps and take on men and vehicles. Similar construction was unnecessary in the western base section, which loaded fewer troops and employed coasters and deep-sea vessels. Movement through southern base section was effected by transportation corps personnel at the various echelons of command. On the basis of MOVCO daily force movement tables, the regional transportation officer, southern base section, issued road and rail instructions for the movement of units from concentration areas into marshalling areas. These instructions were carried out by the district transportation officers and their RTOs. Sector headquarters, agencies set up by the southern base section, controlled movements from the marshalling areas to embarkation points within their assigned territories. Upon receipt of Turco vessel availability notices and MOVCO force movement tables, the sector broke units down into craft and shiploads, and called them forward from the marshalling areas. During May 1944, with Lieutenant Colonel Leo J. Amaya in command, all cargo discharge operations ceased at Southampton, and the port personnel concentrated their efforts on preparations for the Normandy invasion. The build-up of troops and vehicles was handled through Southampton and Portland Weymouth, although Falmouth and Plymouth were also used somewhat in the early stages. The marshalling of units in the areas that backed up these ports began before D-Day. When the invasion was postponed from the 5th to the 6th of June, the British temporarily halted their troop flow, but the Americans continued to move units from concentration areas to marshalling camps and embarkation points. This led to the first signs of congestion in the marshalling camps and at the ports. U.S. activities at Southampton, the principal port of embarkation, were almost nil on D-Day, since the British were using the area to embark their forces, but beginning the 7th of June the port was crowded with marching columns of U.S. troops and long convoys of vehicles, tanks, and other material. In the first few days, movements forward from concentration areas conformed to the U.S. First Army's build-up priority tables, but thereafter the tactical situation dictated frequent changes. At the outset the port experienced a serious shortage of personnel, and there were not enough vessels and craft to lift all the forces moving into the port area. The week that followed was attended by congestion, confusion, and a temporary loss of control of the mounting machinery. On the 9th of June Bucco ordered the loading of units on vessels as rapidly as possible regardless of priority and directed the temporary curtailment of movements into the marshalling camps behind Southampton. Units were then moved into embarkation points and loaded on ships and craft as rapidly as they became available. At the piers and hards, embarkation had to be accomplished on short notice and often without the benefit even of hurriedly prepared plans. Outloadings of personnel and vehicles reached a peak in July 1944 and continued heavy through September. During this period there was some simplification of organization and procedures in the southern base section. Beginning in July, troops scheduled for loading on deep-sea troop transports were entrained at concentration area camps and moved directly to the waterfront. In the following month, marshalling Area C, which funneled units into Southampton, was turned over to the 14th Port. Previously, this marshalling area had been run by the sector headquarters, which had controlled the movement of units to the embarkation points. With this transfer, the area became the staging area of the 14th Port, which was given responsibility for the movement of troops from there to loading points. By the end of September 1944, a total of 1,462,426 personnel had been outloaded from the United Kingdom for the continent. The heaviest embarkations of men and vehicles were over the piers and hearts at Southampton. In the period 6th of June-September 1944, 686,868 personnel were embarked at this port on landing ship infantries, motor transports, landing ship tanks, and landing craft tanks, and 140,303 vehicles were loaded aboard motor transports, landing ship tanks and landing craft tanks. In addition, the port played an important role in the outloading of cargo, rolling stock and bulk POL. The port facilities were shared by the Americans and the British on a day-to-day allocation made in accordance with the tactical needs. It had been expected that troops would move from the United States directly to the continent after September, but inadequate port and staging facilities on the far shore led to a continuation of important outloading activities from the United Kingdom. From September 1944 through VE Day, large troopships, including the Queen's, the Mauretania, and the Aquitania, brought U.S. troops into the Clyde and Mersey ports for immediate transshipment to the continent. These troops were then moved by train to Southampton and its subports in the Portland-Weymouth area, which at that time was handling all cross-channel troop shipments. Despite some interference with the normal movements of units to the continent, a shortage of shipping, and bad weather, the transshipment program was accomplished smoothly. With the exception of periods of adverse weather conditions, troops were disembarked at the Clyde and Mersey areas and re-embarked at Southampton and Portland within 18 hours. The transshipment operation ultimately involved 82 troop transports, over 300,000 troops, and the operation in Great Britain of 742 special trains. On the southern coast, the 14th port at Southampton, in addition to handling the greatest part of the troop and vehicle embarkation program, outloaded a large proportion of the supplies and equipment moved to the continent. During the first 90 days of the invasion, 14th port outloadings, including ammunition, package POL, general cargo, bulk POL, and vehicles, totaled 990,341 long tons. In the course of loading troops, vehicles, and cargo during this period, the port handled no fewer than 3,517 vessels and landing craft. Other important south coast ports were Plymouth and Falmouth, which were used under the supervision of the 13th port to load ammunition and package POL, respectively. Although the primary emphasis was placed on the regularly scheduled movement of supplies, it was recognized that the shipment of certain items might have to be expedited to meet urgent needs on the far shore. Therefore, blood, medical supplies, radio sets and parts, and other high-priority freight were to be carried under a Red Ball Express system. Dispatched through Southampton, express shipments were limited to approximately 100 deadweight tons per day. As the invasion date drew near, marine equipment poured into the British Isles. More than 100 tugs, up to 86 feet in length, were shipped as deck cargo. The larger seagoing tugs generally proceeded to the theatre under their own power, while other floating equipment, notably the oil barges and car floats to be used for cross-channel ferrying of petroleum products and railway rolling stock, had to be towed on the hazardous passage across the Atlantic. These craft were to play a vital role in the invasion. 3 tugs of the 329th Harbour Craft Company towed units for the artificial harbour to the far shore, and a 4th was active in the initial Normandy landings. Specially equipped LSDs were scheduled to move assembled railway cars to France. Rails were laid on the lower deck, and the ramp was modified. The cars were loaded and unloaded over track laid on improvised shoreside ramps that could be raised or lowered with the tide. The LST was made fast to the tracked ramp, and the cars were pulled on or off as required. Such ramps were constructed first at Southampton and later in Cherbourg, the principal terminals for cross-channel railway traffic. By the 6th of June, some 15 LSTs had been converted to ferry rolling stock. Actual ferrying to the continent was begun in the following month. Larger rolling stock, such as locomotives, refrigerator, and passenger cars were lifted on British sea ferries, on the 2 American sea trains, and aboard a number of large car floats that had been towed to the theatre from New York. The sea trains operated mainly between Cardiff and Cherbourg, while the ferries shuttled between Southampton and Cherbourg. The 14th port loaded approximately 90% of the rail equipment being shipped to the continent aboard landing ship tanks, sea trains, and ferries. The 14th port also maintained a detachment at Hamble and Fawley to assist in the joint loading of British and American oil tankers. Beginning on D-Day, almost all the U.S. military resources slowly built up since January 1942 had to be shipped out during a relatively short period. The preloaded build-up forces were aboard 1 day later. Aside from the 5th and 8th Divisions, which embarked from Northern Ireland in late June and early July, and the 9th Armoured Group which loaded at Swansea in the Bristol Channel area, the bulk of the normal build-up forces moved through the southern base section, with Southampton and its subports with an estimated outloading capacity of 27,678 deadweight tons daily were allocated for US and British requirements, with each nation receiving about half the capacity. The American allocation was later increased to 17,903 deadweight tons daily, based on the use of the Bristol Channel ports of Fowey, Plymouth, and part of Southampton. To assist in lifting this American tonnage, the British Ministry of War Transport made available 184 coasters. While supply movement plans and procedures were being developed, the Transportation Corps devised several special expedients for delivering essential equipment and material across the Channel. Among these was the use of converted Liberty ships as motor transport vessels to carry trucks and drivers to Normandy. The conversion, which was accomplished by U.S. military railway shock battalion detachments, involved ballasting and flooring off the lower hold, so as to provide space for vehicles in 4 of the hatches, the installation of deck latrines, and the conversion of the 5th hatch into living quarters for the drivers who accompanied each shipment. The average vessel lifted approximately 120 loaded vehicles and 500 men on each outbound voyage. The 14th port at Southampton took the lead in dispatching MTVs to support the invasion force. At first, vehicles were discharged on the far shore by barge or lighter, using the ship's own gear. Under the supervision of the 14th port, American and Canadian personnel cooperated in building huge rafts, similar to those employed to float lumber on the Columbia River in the Pacific Northwest and consisting of large bundles of wooden poles and piling bound together by cables. At Southampton and Poole, the 14th port had the pre-invasion project of stowing 104 self-propelled barges, LBV type, with ammunition, petroleum products, and quartermaster supplies. Because of the supreme importance of having sufficient gasoline and oil to sustain the Allied air and ground offensive, the 14th port was also made responsible for loading a special pool of tankers at the installations of Hamble and Fawley. The preloading of the large fleet of coasters, barges, and landing craft commenced on the 4th of May. By D-Day a total of 107,606 deadweight tons had been preloaded for shipment to the far shore. Of the 5 British hospital carriers assigned to the Normandy beachheads, 3 were staffed with US and 2 with British Army medical personnel. From January through April 1945 the number of patients evacuated from the theatre by ship never fell below 23,000 a month. In the United Kingdom, Southampton and Portland initially served as reception ports. Patients debarking at piers and Hearts were either moved by ambulance and trucked to nearby transit hospitals, or were placed in hospital trains for movement direct to general hospitals. Because of its proximity to the continent, its excellent facilities, and the experienced Army port organization, Southampton remained active to the end of the war. The port was also destined to play a prominent part in the redeployment and repatriation of American troops and in the movement of British war brides to the United States. On the arrival in the European theatre of war, the task of directing American transportation activities in the United Kingdom was assumed by a young, inexperienced transportation corps in the formative stage. Yet they cut their teeth in the heat of war and were the backbone of Allied logistics, executing the largest movement of men and material in military history. Above the doorway to the Southampton Art Gallery rooms, which were used as the headquarters for the U.S. Army during D-Day and Operation Overlord, there was a plaque which said, "Presented by the 14th Major Port U.S. Army in acknowledgement of the generosity of the Borough of Southampton, which during the mayoralty of Rex Stranger MC gratuitously provided the section of the Civic Centre for use as headquarters for the port." It was from here that orders emanated directing the movement of the vast American armies through Southampton and other South Coast ports between June 1944 and the end of hostilities in the Great War for the liberation of Europe. Outside the entrance to the headquarters, where a GI once stood on guard, there is another plaque which reads, "This tablet records that a wing of the Civic Centre was used as headquarters by the 14th Major Port U.S. Army during World War II. Between D-Day, June 6 and the end of hostilities, orders were issued from here directing the embarkation of American armies who together with their allies sailed from Southampton docks to liberate Europe. During the operation over 2,250,000 troops, 250,000 vehicles and millions of tons of supplies of the U.S. Army were shipped through this port." The commander of the 14th port at Southampton received the British Order of Merit, the CBE, and the citation reads, "Both during the build-up and since, the liaison and cooperation between the British and American forces in the Southampton area have been excellent. He has always been most anxious to cooperate, and his relations with the Royal Navy, police, local authorities, Southern Railway and Harbour Board have been equally cordial and helpful. His deputy received an OBE for his willing and untiring efforts to do all in his power to further the common cause. Granting the freedom of Southampton, the traditionally robed town clerk faced the GIs, said in a loud voice, "Know all men by those present that Mayor, Aldermen and Burgesses of the Borough of Southampton, conferred upon the 14th Major Port of the Transportation Corps of the United States Army, in recognition of the outstanding achievement of all ranks of that formation, in embarking from the port of Southampton between D-Day and VE Day nearly 2 million men of the United States forces, for the liberation of Europe, and in appreciation of the cordial relations, friendships, and cooperation they established with the citizens of Southampton, the privilege, honor and distinction of marching through the streets of the town of Southampton, with bayonets fixed, drums beating, and colors flying,